This is Dateline News and Conversation. I'm on fire tonight. There's a couple of really big stories. Number one, the Zionist regime in Israel have begun their attacks on Rafah. Meanwhile, the United States is quiet. The two reports that possibly holding back 2 arms shipments to Israel. That's strange, isn't it? Continuing to send them missiles and bombs to kill innocent Palestinians. My question is, where's the resistance? And the resistance being the PLO, Hamas, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, maybe even Egypt, because these people are all going to flee to the deserts in Egypt. And then the next really big story, the ambassadors from London and Paris were summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry, and they were subsequently taken out behind the woodshed for a big ass whooping. This is big news. And then Russia, in response to these aggressive actions and words of the United States, the UK, France, and some of those other unfriendly countries, have begun tactical missile drills on their border, not far from Crimea, and in Belarus. My guest tonight, my good friend, Dimitri Laskaris. Dimitri, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Regis. Always a pleasure talking to you.
All right. You're my go-to guy on the Middle East, on Gaza. I'm already seeing reports that Israeli tanks have entered into Rafah, where there's over 1 million, I guess maybe 1 million or more, Palestinians who went there because they were told they would be safe. And I saw a video of explosions in this city of Rafah. Dimitri, what are your thoughts? This is really making me boil.
Yeah, some days it's I choke on my anger, Regis, and I find words fail me. And the primary source of my inexpressible indignation is that all of this is being made possible by Western governments. And in fact, I think the evidence now leaves no real doubt that Western governments want Israel to obliterate the Palestinian people. It's not simply that they are reluctant to stop it. They want it. There was an op-ed done by, I came to this conclusion myself weeks ago, but there was an op-ed by Craig Murray, former British diplomat, about a week ago. It came to my attention, in which he said precisely the same thing. I think, when people keep providing, when governments keep providing to a rogue, criminal, diabolical regime like that of Israel the weapons necessary to obliterate a civilian population, and the government of Israel is telling you that that's exactly what they intend to do, as they have from the very beginning back in October, and you do nothing to stop it, I think that the inference we ought to draw is that the provider of the weapons wants them to be used in this manner. There's no reason, just because Blinken gets in front of the microphone, starts flapping his gums and saying, or unnamed sources, it's usually not Blinken, it's unnamed sources in the US government saying Biden is frustrated, doesn't mean that this isn't the desired outcome. It is the desired outcome. That should be our operating assumption. And it's important to understand a few things. I mean, this is no surprise, because Netanyahu himself said days ago that they would invade Rafah whether there was a ceasefire deal or not. It was astonishing. He was basically guaranteeing that there would be no ceasefire deal, because why would Hamas agree to turn over the hostages if Israel is going to destroy Rafah anyways and obliterate, tens of thousands of civilians potentially? Obviously, it's not going to do that. So Netanyahu made it clear what his intentions were. The Americans knew this was coming, and he's simply carrying out his intentions. Another thing to bear in mind is that the attack on Rafah didn't start today. The tanks moved in today, but they've been bombing tents for several days now. They've killed, I think, dozens of civilians who were sheltering in Rafah in tents. So again, this shouldn't surprise anybody. The West could have stopped it. The West doesn't want to stop it. The West is enabling it. Our operating assumption should be that the West wants Israel to commit genocide. It's as horrible as that.
You know, I never really felt it emotionally or viscerally, the horror, the obscene violence, until last week when I saw a video on Netflix. It was called Born in Gaza. It was shot by a Spanish director, filmmaker, and they interviewed and followed a number of young kids from Gaza, 2014 now, and having them talk about their lives and what they experienced. Dimitri, it was gut wrenching. And I know you haven't had a chance to see this, but this got me so emotionally upset that in a way that I haven't felt up until now. The obscene, evil, violence that this regime that we're talking about, this Zionist regime in Israel, has been inflicting on over 30,000 innocent men, women, and children, blowing up their hospitals, blowing up their schools, blowing up their neighborhoods. I mean, complete, total devastation, the likes of which the world has never seen. Now, Dimitri, the world is responding. The people of the United States are responding. The kids on university campuses, there's over 120 now that are supposedly joined the effort. High school kids are joining the effort. Adults of all generations are waking up to this atrocity. Universities in Europe are joining. Millions and millions of people, Dimitri, all over the world, in all the major capitals. Millions are lining the streets on a daily basis saying, stop. Dimitri, your thoughts on the growing resistance and protests of people in the United States, Canada, your country, your home country, and around the world. Your thoughts?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I have the utmost respect and admiration for every one of those campus protesters and all those extraordinary academics who have come to their defense, some of whom have been brutalized by police and arrested with absolutely no lawful justification whatsoever. And there are videos of this available. It's horrifying to see professors, tenured professors, being dragged off like criminals because they're trying to defend peaceful anti-genocide protesting students. So they deserve our utmost respect and admiration. I'm sad to say, however, that so far, this has not changed one iota the policies of Western governments. And if the protests are going to be effective, it seems, I hope I'm wrong about this, and I hope that the Western governments are on the verge right now under pressure from these students and academics and other members of civil society, on the verge of capitulating to the demands of the people and to human conscience. But I so far see no real sign of that, which means that we are going to have to escalate. As admirable and courageous as this is, we're going to have to muster a lot more in terms of our willingness to be brutalized and in terms of the numbers of people who are going out and demanding justice for the Palestinian people. The pressure must be increased dramatically and as quickly as possible before Israel completes this diabolical project. I want to say a word as well, because we forget about them. You know, we live here in the West, and we're very focused, understandably, on what our fellow citizens of conscience are doing to stop this. But there is resistance going on within Palestine itself and in West Asia. And there are people who are giving up their lives to put up armed resistance to this murderous gang of thieves in Jerusalem, backed by their murderous imperialists in the capitals of the West. There was, for example, an attack I was, as you know, Regis, and we talked about in the prior program, I was in Palestine, occupied Palestine in April, I believe, March actually, I think it was, and one of the places I visited was a settlement, an Israeli settlement near Rafah. It was on the Israeli side of the Gaza Egyptian border. With the that hear me, but the image is gone. Can you hear me now?
Oh, we're getting this interruption again. This is happening occasionally, and it's really very irritating. Can you hear me, Dimitri? Your image froze. Hang in there with me. Hopefully that our internet
Regis, I don't
connection
know
will.
if you can hear me. I can't hear you.
Yeah. Hang in there. Hang in there with me. Hang in there. I'm really getting tired of these bullshit interruptions. I'm not sure what it is. If it's because I'm in the Russian Federation, I'm having to use a VPN. Dimitri is back. There you go. You're back.
I'm trying a different way to connect to the internet. Sorry about that, Regis. I'm up on the mountain in Greece, and my internet is not the best, unfortunately.
Well, this has happened to me with other guests as well. I don't know if it's because I'm in Russia, if it's because I'm using a VPN. It doesn't seem to happen on any other shows that I'm watching of other people. I just keep getting this interruptions often enough that it's really aggravating. But pick it up when you were saying that you visited Gaza and Rafah near the Israeli-Egyptian border. That's where I lost you.
So I never actually got into Gaza when I was there in March, but I went all along the border of Gaza on the Israeli side, starting near the Mediterranean coast and then coming inland to a settlement, an Israeli settlement called Sderot, and then I drove south to the Egyptian border. And just before the border, again, I'm on the Israeli side of Egypt, there was a settlement called Kerem Shalom, and an Israeli settlement, and there was a military base there. I actually drove by it and I saw a whole lot of tanks. Well, 2 days ago, I think it was, somehow, even after all the devastation that has been inflicted upon Gaza, Palestinian militants fired rockets into that military base. And so far, the Israelis have acknowledged the death of, I believe, 3 soldiers and the wounding of another 10 or 12. Yesterday, Hezbollah launched a drone at a military base in northern Israel, and the Israeli air defense, which is supposed to be impenetrable, failed to shoot down the drone for some reason, and it killed 2 Israeli soldiers, according to the admissions of the Israeli military. Every day, there are attacks happening by Palestinian militants and Hezbollah fighters on the north. Many of them have certainly been killed. Many more have been wounded, but they're continuing to put up resistance. And whatever we think of, these groups, of course, the West regards them as terrorist organizations, and there is evidence that they have, or certainly that Hamas and certain other Palestinian militant groups, not necessarily all of them, have killed civilians. That is true. I accept that. But my question to those who are listening to us is, if our governments are going to do absolutely nothing to stop this monstrosity, and in fact do everything to enable it, and behave in such a way as to lead us to believe quite reasonably that this is what they want to be done, who's going to save the Palestinian people? I mean, what else do they have but armed resistance, such as it is? They have no other alternative. And we have no right in the West. We certainly have a right to demand that all militants, all governments, all state and non-state actors observe the laws of war. But we certainly have no right to deprive them altogether of their armed resistance, of their entitlement to armed resistance. That's all they have, Regis. Yeah, despite all of the admirable efforts of civil society in the West, this is descending ever deeper into the bottomless well of human depravity before our very eyes.
Yeah. I'm quite frankly very sick and tired of the Israeli whining about being the victim, about having the right to self-defense, when they are out there fucking bombing innocent people who are not combatants, who don't have guns, who don't have tanks, who don't have aircraft that can drop bombs on them. I'm sick and tired of this nefarious, this mendacious.
Sorry to interrupt you, but it's the ultimate proof of the sickness of Western society that they're allowed to get away with this audacious lie. How can you portray yourself as the victim when you're doing the things that you just described, Regis? I mean, and this claim is taken seriously by Western governments and media. We live in a sick society. The sickness is not limited to Israel. The sickness is just as deep in our own societies that we allow this to be done by our governments.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Talking about resistance now, and by the way, this is another one of the freaking lies that the United States has been saying about the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, calling them all terrorists. These people are simple nomads, very simple people, defending their countries against this imperial onslaught. And we see it everywhere that the empire goes. They call them terrorists. Well, the real terrorists, as you and I know, are the United States of America. It's lapdog vassals all across Europe.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about the resistance now, because there is resistance. You mentioned the PLO, Hezbollah, Hamas. I'm calling them the resistance, capital letters: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, and maybe even Egypt. I believe, and I'd like your opinion on this, Dimitri, I think these countries and these organizations are the only hope to put an end to this violence and to put an end to the Zionist, Satanist regime in Israel. Your thoughts?
Certainly, they're the best hope right now that the Palestinian people have. Absolutely. Israel is, I think, reeling from the blows that it has taken. Its weakness has been displayed for all the world to see. Its adversaries know that it isn't the military behemoth that it's always advertised to have been, and maybe it was at one point in time, but now it clearly isn't. Hezbollah has been, as I mentioned, launching attacks every day, virtually every day, for over 6 months. And I follow very carefully the statements of these resistant groups, which on a Telegram's channel, which I recommend to people who want to have their perspective as well, and not just the Israeli perspective. It's called the Resistance News Network, and they give detailed accounts of what they're doing, what they're attacking, the time of day that they attack, what part of the front line their target is situated. And they frequently accompany those with videos. Oftentimes, the Israeli side will at least implicitly, if not explicitly, acknowledge the attack, as it did in the instance where this drone yesterday, the day before, killed 2 Israeli soldiers in the north of Israel. And what has Israel been able to do in response? It's certainly caused a lot of death and destruction, but it's not invaded Lebanon. There's no indication that it's going to attempt that again because, frankly, it got its ass kicked in 2006 when it invaded South Lebanon. And Hezbollah is a much more formidable force now than it is then. Then you have Ansar Allah in Yemen. I mean, Ansar Allah, the Western media really don't want to talk about it, but this huge armada and flotilla that was sent down by these European states and the United States to confront Ansar Allah has largely receded from the scene. Many of these vessels have returned. One of the captains of one of these vessels, I believe it was a Northern European NATO country. When his vessel returned, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but that this was, they'd never seen anything like it. The use of the drones, the sophistication of what Ansar Allah was doing, and that it really tested the limits of their capacity to defend themselves. Others left because they simply didn't have the ability to deal with it, frankly, or their defective military equipment broke down, or they ran out of munitions. So Ansar Allah, which has a tiny little military budget relative to any one of these countries that was confronting it in the Red Sea, has effectively won that war. They're continuing to do exactly what they did before. And in fact, they're escalating in whatever way they can to assist the Palestinian people. You have groups in Iraq. Again, you see the reports of this accompanied by video on Resistance News Network. They're firing cruise missiles. You don't see any reports about this in the Western media, but they're firing cruise missiles at major Israeli military targets like Haifa, like Ashdod, the port of Ashdod, like Eilat. Every day, there are missiles, cruise missiles, drones being launched from Iraq and Syria by these other militant groups at Israel. Israel is besieged on all sides. And even with all the destruction it has inflicted upon Gaza, Regis, it still has not recovered the hostages. It got 3 of them. That's it. It's killed many more of them than it's actually recovered. The vast majority of them remain in the custody of the Palestinian militants. They haven't killed any of the senior leaders of Gaza of Hamas in Gaza, not a single one, and they're still suffering casualties after 6 months. This screams and smells of a strategic defeat on the part of Israel, and all of this. I didn't even get into the economic damage that the country is suffering, and now you have Turkey's president Erdogan finally belatedly cutting off economic ties with Israel. I believe there's some $7 billion of trade that has been terminated because finally he was moved to act. And this is just piling on to the additional the economic damage that Israel has already sustained. So the good news here, to the extent there is good news, is that I think that Israel, and I've said this before and I'm more convinced of it than ever, eventually Israel is going to fall. Its apartheid regime will fall. I believe that day is coming soon. I think it could very well happen within the next few months. But what civil society can do, first of all, we shouldn't take it for granted that that's going to happen thanks to the resistance and the economic damage. We should assume the worst, that our efforts are going to be needed. But even if it's inevitable that it will happen, I believe it is, we can expedite the end of the genocide and save many lives. So we still, as civil society, have a very important role to play. Whatever the capabilities of the resistance may be, whatever the economic damage may be that Israel is suffering, and everybody needs to rise to this occasion. Everybody who has a voice needs to be heard.
Yeah, you and I are both against war. I certainly am not a pacifist, but I believe that these people have a right to defend themselves. Very much a right to defend themselves as the Jews or as the Israelis, the Zionists are claiming they have in this little illegal fake regime that we call Israel. I'm standing here on the sidelines and I'm listening to you talk about the resistance, and I'm like almost cheering. And when I'm seeing all of these young kids in the United States, in Canada, and throughout the rest of the world, increasing in numbers every day, I'm feeling more hopeful.
Me too.
Because it's old people like myself and my friends who have been protesting against the empire for most of their lives. Now the young people have got to realize that the future is theirs. Our time is past. Dimitri, I can see that we're frozen again. I wanted to change the subject here. The next big story, I believe, in the news today is Russia Foreign Ministry called the ambassadors of England and France to the foreign ministry.
Causing an explosion of indignation.
And I describe it.
I would not at all be surprised to see these protests on university campuses morph into a larger movement that finally holds the elites in the West accountable for the many crimes and depravities and their complete and utter contempt for the interests of ordinary people in their society. And I think that's what really scares them the most, frankly, is that they think that this might very well spiral into a broad-based movement addressing a whole range of grievances that have been simmering for decades.
Yeah, we're having trouble again with our internet connection, but I got most of that. I, like you, am hoping that this movement will morph and continue to grow. And I think that these young people are beginning to realize what is behind this evil that's taking place in Israel. I'm hoping that they're going to make the connections. It's the same group of people, the same evil Satanists who are behind Ukraine, who are behind the threats to Taiwan and North Korea and Iran. I'm really hoping that they're going to see the connection to all of these. Dimitri, I wanted to move on. I started to say when your image froze up again that over the weekend, the ambassadors of England and France were called to the Russian Foreign Ministry because of the Foreign Secretary of the UK, David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, coming out and saying publicly that Ukraine could use their Storm Shadow missiles for long-range targets into mainland Russia. This infuriated Russia. And at the same time, Macron insisting that he's going to send troops to Ukraine. Poland and the Baltics are getting more and more aggressive in their rhetoric. And so the ambassadors of the United Kingdom and France were summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry. There was no readout from either side. When those two ambassadors left the meeting, they had no comment for the press. They actually looked a bit terrified. And what I think happened, I liken to they were taken out behind the foreign ministry woodshed and they were given a real ass whooping. And this was not just a message to London and Paris. It was a shot across the bow to the United States of America. It was a famous quote that the Russian Foreign Ministry said to then Ambassador Sullivan, "Nyet means yet. Do not cross this line. You've gone too far, and now we're at the end of our rope." And they left, and they brought that message back. It remains to be seen what's going to happen. But Russia immediately followed up these two meetings by announcing that Russia was now engaging in snap exercise drills of their tactical missile commands. And just today, Belarus also admitted they are using drills to prepare for the use of tactical missiles. Dimitri, you may have missed a little bit of what I said, but I was basically talking about the ass whooping that the ambassadors from London and Paris got this past weekend out behind the Russian Foreign Ministry. What were your thoughts on the significance of these events that had just taken place?
Well, the first thing that came to mind, first word that popped into my head was desperation. What we're seeing is a fantastic and extraordinarily dangerous series of desperate acts and statements by Western leaders. And it isn't because they are genuinely worried. I mean, maybe the more ideologically brainwashed of them are, but I don't think they're genuinely worried that Russia is going to steamroll into Poland if it finishes off Zelensky's military. I think what they're really worried about is the political backlash that it will come. You know, we need to remember a couple of things here that are so swiftly forgotten. The first is that NATO had its ass handed to it by the Taliban in Afghanistan after 20 years. That was an even bigger debacle when you consider the limits of the Taliban's arsenal and its military budget, its training, the size of its forces, and so forth. And in that case, NATO itself was directly engaged in warfare. They weren't acting simply through proxies, although they did use proxies in Afghanistan as well. And yet the Taliban drove NATO from Afghanistan. This happened a few months before the invasion of before the special military operation, as Russian government refers to it, in Ukraine in February of 2022. And there ought to have been a massive political reckoning at that moment. They spent trillions of dollars on that war, Regis, trillions of dollars, and lost to the Taliban. It should have raised a host of very serious questions. Political heads should have rolled. People should have been tossed out of office. But there were two reasons why that didn't happen, in my opinion. The first reason it didn't happen is because the Western media basically ignored the Afghan war for more than a decade after it began. The last 10 to 15 years, it basically pretended that it wasn't even happening. You barely ever saw any reports about it. So when the debacle unfolded, people had largely forgotten about the Afghanistan war. But the other thing is that the media quickly shifted from talking about the debacle, reluctantly talking about the epic debacle in Afghanistan, to talking about the potential for war in Ukraine. They found another war to distract the public. Now the problem here is that whereas in the case of Afghanistan, the media, the Western media, basically did everything they could to bury the stories of the war. And there were lots of, for those of us who are paying attention, there were stories out there, particularly in the independent media, the non-Western media, about NATO atrocities in Afghanistan. But in the case of Ukraine, they have done everything they can, the Western media and the political elite, to keep the subject of that war uppermost in people's minds for 2 years. They only started to talk about it less when it was clear that Ukraine's offensive last summer was a colossal failure, as John Mearsheimer has called it. But up until then, this was front page news every single day in every major Western media organization. And what were they telling us? They were telling us that Russia's on the ropes, that Putin is fragile, that he's got cancer, that he's losing his mind, that the Russian people are about to rebel, that the Ukrainian military is steamrolling the Russians, killing huge numbers of them. Victory is at hand. This is what we heard for 2 years, every day, from every major government in the West and from every major Western media organization. And now what the West is about to see is that the Ukrainian military has been obliterated. Right now, it's plausibly deniable still that Ukraine hasn't been defeated, because there haven't been huge tracts of Ukrainian territory that the Russians have seized. They've been steadily, methodically moving. The pace at which they're acquiring additional territory is quickening. That is all true. And relative to the pace at which they were acquiring territory last year, this is relatively fast, but you still haven't seen a massive change in terms of the distribution of territory between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces. That is coming. And when it happens, I think there's going to be a political explosion. I certainly hope so, because that's exactly what Western governments deserve. There should be an uprising. People should say, oh my God, for 2 years you told us that these hundreds of billions of dollars were going to deliver victory to us, and all you've done is destroyed the country of Ukraine. That's it. And you've made Russia stronger. The country that you said is a mortal threat to us is now economically and military and politically stronger, and they've destroyed Ukraine. And what do we have to show for this massive expenditure with which you preoccupied us over the last 2 years? There should be an uprising, and frankly, there may well be one, and I think that's what they're really afraid of. So now they're just flailing. They're doing anything they can to put a stop to the Russian victory, but in the course of doing that, they're risking nuclear war. These people have lost their minds. They're more concerned about their political hide and the potential instability that their depravity and lies are likely to cause than they are about the potential for a Holocaust that wipes out all of humanity. So we're in a very, very dangerous moment right now. And it isn't because they're afraid that Russia is going to come after them next. It's because they're afraid that the people are going to come after them next.
Very well stated. I think that that it is going to happen this summer, certainly by fall. Everything that I'm reading in alt media, Russian bloggers, Ukrainian bloggers who are pro-Russian, Russia is moving very methodically, taking back kilometer by kilometer of territory of Russian ancestral lands, as they refer to it. I think that Russia is going to have to go all the way to Odessa and Kiev to achieve its three goals: the demilitarization, denazification, and the complete neutrality of Ukraine, which is going to require a redoing of their constitution and elimination of all of these nationalists, Stepan Bandera Nazis that have infiltrated and taken over the government. I don't see how Russia can stop and agree to some kind of a peace deal when Russia knows they lost 27 million people fighting the Nazis in World War II. They're fighting them again. They don't want to do it again. And so I think that what is coming, and I think is going to happen this year, and, you know, Dimitri, I don't like to speculate, but everybody's talking about the American election coming up in November. And I agree with you. I think these people who are controlling things in the United States are desperate. I think they're frightened. And they have to be when they look out across the country and they see these massive protests against what their government is doing in Palestine, for Israel. They have to be worried that the pitchforks are coming out. I couldn't agree with you more. You know, I want to return to the subject of the resistance. Do you think Egypt is going to be forced to do something if millions of people, over 1 million people, are forced to leave Rafah and to flee as refugees to Egypt? What do you think that's going to do to Sisi in Egypt? Is it going to undermine him? Is he in political trouble?
Well, if I were him, I'd certainly be concerned. No doubt about it. I mean, you know, I think I've mentioned this in a prior discussion we had. I'm old enough to recall the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and he was killed by people who were upset about the détente that he had entered into with Israel's colonial regime. And could that fate befall Sisi? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, even Sadat, the condition of the Palestinian people was nothing as horrible as it is today when he was assassinated. And let's remember that there was a popular uprising in Egypt, which removed from power Hosni Mubarak. You know, we can all remember, you don't have to be old my age to remember that, you know, the protest in Tahrir Square. And what happened was that the first democratically elected president in Egypt, certainly in my lifetime, I think ever, Mohamed Morsi, was removed from power in a coup, which was supported by the West after about a year. Why was he removed from power? Because he was moving in the direction of actually doing what the Egyptian people wanted their government to do, including be far more supportive of the Palestinian people. So if I were Sisi, I'd be quaking in my boots. But to be honest with you, I don't know if that man has any conscience in him. And I think he may, continue to be a collaborator till the bitter end. And if things get so bad that he feels that his regime is seriously at risk or his life is at risk, he'll just go, live in some posh villa somewhere off of his stolen proceeds of government money in some Western country or in some Gulf state. So he may choose that course of action and just right to the bitter end continue to be a collaborator with the genocidal regime. On the other hand, who knows? Maybe he'll finally do what his people want, because I have no doubt that the vast majority of Egyptian people are appalled at what is happening and sickened by their government's collaboration with this genocidal monster. So who knows? I think probably a place where there's even going to be more danger of political instability and potentially the overthrow of a Western vassal in West Asia is in Jordan. The Jordanian monarchy right now must be even more concerned about its survival than the Egyptian dictator, because there are millions of people of Palestinian origin living in Jordan, and they've been protesting with increasing levels of ferocity, despite the fact that thousands of them have been arrested by the Jordanian monarchy. So, and the Jordanian monarch provoked a lot of anger amongst his people when he helped Israel to defend itself against the Iranian retaliatory missile and drone attack, which was provoked by Israel's destruction, its criminal destruction of Iran's consulate in Damascus. A lot of people are angry in Jordan about that. So who knows? All bets are off where this is going to go. The West Asia in 6 months' time could look radically different from what it looks like today. On the other hand, it might look very much the same. But if I were a betting man, I would say it's more likely that it's going to look radically different.
Okay. Here's a big question. Nobody's talking about it much. Russia entered Syria at the request of al-Assad to help put down the rebellion. And I believe the reason Russia did that is because of their own self-interest. They're very concerned that terrorists will move from Iraq, from Syria, from the Middle East directly into Russia. I know I've had Russian friends who have told me that really is why Russia moved. Now, with this current conflict, Putin has said a couple of things. And over the years, he's been very friendly with Netanyahu. They've been very supportive of the Israeli state. But on the other hand, Putin has said recently it's our moral responsibility to stand with the Palestinians. What do you make of this? It seems to be a contradiction in terms, but do you see Russia as having a dog in this fight?
Absolutely. I think it was Russia's intervention in Syria. And let's be clear, the government that asked him, whatever you may think about it, the Assad government was the internationally recognized government of Syria and is today. And they asked for Russian intervention. So the intervention from an international legal standpoint was lawful. But that didn't mean that, the Russian Federation was obliged to do it. They could have taken a pass. And I think they chose to do it in part because they were worried about the spread of terrorism, and that eventually coming to their own borders. They had already had some horrific experiences with that during the last 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. But also they have a naval base in the Mediterranean in Syria, which I think matters a great deal to them in Latakia. That's the only naval base I believe they have in the Mediterranean. So I think that they wanted to preserve that because they knew that if the West installed another vassal in Syria, that would be the end of the Russian naval base. But in any event, when it comes to Israel, I mean, Putin has to be concerned that a very significant proportion of the Israeli population are Russian. They're Russian Jewish citizens of Israel. So I think that has weighed on him in terms of his policies towards Israel. He's also, I think he tends to be very much in the school of realpolitik, and he knows that Israel has a formidable military, or at least it was purported to have one. I don't know that it does anymore. And it certainly has a nuclear arsenal, and it had the backing of the United States. It was a major, player in the region. And that was another reason why I think Putin was trying to maintain, diplomatic relations with Israel. But this has all changed now. I'm not saying that Putin is going to intervene on behalf of the Palestinians militarily, but I think that the calculus has changed considerably because, first of all, Israel has escalated its attacks on Iran, which is a strategic ally of Russia in West Asia and is becoming very quickly the most dominant state in the region. Secondly, Israel's government was not particularly shy about supporting Zelensky throughout the war in Ukraine. It certainly was doing that rhetorically, and it may well have helped him militarily in a number of ways, probably more so behind the scenes than publicly, but I'm sure the Russians have some information about that as well. And furthermore, the Russians can read the tea leaves, and global opinion is overwhelmingly against this genocidal monster, particularly in the BRICS countries. So in Brazil and in India, well, not so much in India. I mean, amongst the Muslim population, the government of India, I think, is trying to maintain good relations with Russia. But South Africa, absolutely, which led the case against the genocidal monster at the International Court of Justice. In most of Africa, throughout West Asia, amongst Arabic peoples and predominantly Muslim states like Indonesia and Malaysia. So that too is something I'm sure that Vladimir Putin is very cognizant of this, and he sees this as an opportunity to generate more goodwill in those parts of the world, which have stood by the Russian people by and large, and the Russian government through the Ukraine war. And lastly, I do think that there is genuine horror on the part of the Russian government at what is happening here. I've paid some attention to the speeches of the Russian ambassador to the United Nations in various Security Council debates. And although Putin himself has used fairly restrained language to describe, it is very sympathetic language to the Palestinian people. It has been critical language. But if you listen to his ambassador at the UN Security Council, he's given some fiery speeches condemning this genocide consistently. And I think we can assume that was done with the approval of the Russian president. So Israel, I don't think, can any longer count on good relations with Russia. Again, I'm not saying that Russia is going to intervene militarily. I'm not saying it's going to impose economic sanctions on Israel. It may or may not do the latter. But certainly rhetorically and politically, it is firmly on the side of the Palestinians now.
All right. I want to ask another question. Iran demonstrated very clearly how weak Israel's Iron Dome was. Iran didn't use anywhere near the lethal missiles that they had. They did not attempt to destroy infrastructure, kill civilians, but they sent a message. When we're talking about coming to the help of the Palestinians now in Rafah, do you think that Iran is just going to sit on the sidelines until maybe another one of their people are assassinated by Israel? Or do you think that they'll be compelled to enter the fray?
Well, I think they are in the fray right now because they are unquestionably providing material support to groups like Hezbollah. And I'm very confident they provided somehow, some way. I don't know exactly how they did it, given the embargo, the suffocating siege on Gaza. But I'm sure somehow, some way, they provided material support to Hamas. And if there's anything they can do now to do that, they will do it. They're almost certainly providing material support to Ansar Allah, almost certainly providing material support to those resistance groups in Iraq and Syria that are firing cruise missiles and drones at major Israeli targets, in particular its port facilities. So Iran has not withdrawn from the scene. It's not standing by. I think it very much is engaged. And what's interesting to me, I think the Israelis certainly believe that, whether it's true or not. They certainly believe that, as do the U.S. And yet they seem to have decided that that missile attack militates in favor of restraint vis-a-vis Iran, because they haven't really done anything anywhere near the levels of aggression we saw against Iran prior to that missile attack. But I'll tell you, Regis, I think what's even more telling about the frailties of Israel's missile defense are the missiles that are getting through from Hamas and Hezbollah. They're not nearly as sophisticated as the ones these deadly and extraordinarily difficult to handle ballistic missiles that Iran fired as part of this large volley. You know, I mentioned the drone that just got through the air defenses and killed 2 Israeli soldiers. It may have killed more. The Israelis have admitted that 2 of them were killed and a 3rd was seriously wounded. I mentioned that there were some 14 or 15 soldiers a couple of days ago who were seriously wounded or killed by rockets fired from Hamas, from Raffa at the Kerem Shalom military base. There also was a large volley of Katyusha rockets fired by Hezbollah. I think it was yesterday or the day before at Kiryat Shimona, which is near the border with Lebanon, and a number of them landed. You could see videos both from the Lebanese side of the border and from Kiryat Shimona itself. There were houses that were hit. There were cars that were destroyed. So there are a lot of missiles and drones that are getting through the Israeli air defense system. You don't need to fire the most sophisticated ballistic missiles that Iran has, and Iran only used a tiny fraction of them, in order to penetrate Israel's air defenses. So Israel's in real trouble. I think if I were, an Israeli citizen living there, I'd be heading for Ben Gurion Airport and get the hell out.
Yeah. I want to finish on this note. We touched on briefly, and I don't know if we were interrupted or not with an internet blackout there, but the United States is desperate. Those people that are controlling, the Western powers are desperate. They've been even gaslighting the rest of the world over the threat of nuclear war. They're taking what Russia said this weekend, Russia deploying tactical nuclear weapons drills along their border and in Belarus, and they're gaslighting the world. And there are people like Robert Kagan, his wife Victoria Nuland, some of these other people that are shadows in this government. I mean, for years have been saying we can win a nuclear war. There's crazy people in the Pentagon who have even said they can win a nuclear war. When you see this kind of rhetoric from both sides now, Russia reaffirming its nuclear doctrine, it will not strike first, but if threatened, if the Russian mainland is attacked, the Russian state itself is threatened, they will use everything they have. Dmitry, this is complete and total insanity.
Yeah. I don't know that there's been in fact, I'm pretty damn sure there's never been a more dangerous moment in my lifetime. And if I had lived, I was born shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I really don't think we are even at that level of danger. I think we're well beyond it now. And I saw an interview with Scott Ritter about the tactical nuclear missile exercises that Vladimir Putin just announced. And he said, I think with complete justification over and over again, that President Putin isn't bluffing. He doesn't bluff, and he's not bluffing now. Personally, I think it's a little more complex than that. I think it is absolutely true that at some point, Russia will resort to tactical nuclear weapons. But I think that the Russian government, for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to get into, I think it's the right thing to do. They're being somewhat ambiguous about what that precise point will be. The problem we have is that on the other side of the equation, we have lunatics, just stark, bloody mad lunatics who are willing to probe exactly how far they can go before Vladimir Putin orders his military forces to launch tactical nukes. I mean, I don't see how else we can interpret their behavior. For the foreign minister of the UK, which Doug McGregor refers to comedically as the Lilliputian military, to say, expressly that the Ukrainians can use British munitions to attack Russian territory itself, I think is sheer lunacy. It's absolute lunacy. And I'm surprised, actually, that the Russian Federation hasn't attacked a NATO country at this stage. Let's look at what actually is happening. What has happened thus far? They've provided munitions to the Ukrainian military, which the Ukrainian military has used to attack Russian soil. And this has been going on for months. They trained the Ukrainian military in how to use those weapons. They almost certainly provided battlefield intelligence to help the Ukrainian military identify and strike desirable targets, Russian targets. They almost certainly have military advisors on the ground who are at least standing right by the control panel, helping people to target Russian military assets and personnel, sometimes on Russian soil. Someone needs to explain to me how this is different, really, from actually waging war directly against Russia. I mean, they're doing everything but actually pressing the button. And frankly, it may well be that they're doing that too. Either doing it with people who are currently in uniform for the British military or the French military, for example, or they're people who, quote unquote, resigned from the French military or the British military or the United States military, and then were promptly handed Ukrainian citizenship and enrolled in the Ukrainian military, and it just changed their uniform. But they're effectively Western soldiers, NATO soldiers. I think there's a very high risk that, in fact, that has happened. But whether it's happened or not, just what we know about is more than adequate justification from the perspective of the laws of war, I believe, for the Russian Federation to strike military targets in NATO countries, the NATO countries that are providing these weapons, the training, and the intelligence. Effectively, they have been waging war against Russia for 2 years. 2 years. And Russia still hasn't launched a tactical nuke. I mean, these people are playing with fire. And it's quite surprising that Russia hasn't even using conventional weapons struck NATO territory yet. At some point, the patience of the Russian government is going to run out. And I think we're getting very close to that point.
Yeah, I mentioned the ass whooping over the weekend behind the foreign ministry to the ambassadors of the UK and France was a shot over the bow, because what was also said, and it was even further clarified by Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, that we will strike you in Ukraine and beyond. Now, to me, that was very clear. We will strike you in London. We will strike you in Washington. We will strike you in Paris. And we will strike you in Brussels, wherever you are.
And there's another alternative. The other alternative is that they sink, major naval vessels in the Mediterranean, for example. Britain has a military. I was there covering this a few weeks ago. I went to the Akrotiri military base of Britain in Cyprus. Russia could easily flatten that military base, just completely flatten it without using a tactical nuke. So the British, I mean, these people are insane. They're completely exposed. They have no way of defending themselves. Russians have hypersonic missiles. And as we've seen, you don't have to use hypersonic missiles to penetrate the very best air defenses that the West has. Iran not only penetrated Israeli air defenses, they penetrated American, British, French, and Jordanian air defenses. If they can do it, you think the Russians can't using their hypersonic missiles? Of course they can. They can flatten any military target anywhere in the world that NATO has. So the beyond, that word is telling them basically every military asset you have in the world is now in play. If you continue down this path, it's in play. Only sane people would go any further. But unfortunately, we don't have sane people in power in the West.
Well, I'm not even sure they're people. I'm not even sure they're human. I mean, I often refer to it as evil forces, but these people who are doing this and bringing us to the very brink of extinction are not human. They're not expressing human characteristics of of caring for one another, of loving one another, of living in peace and harmony with Mother Earth. I mean, these are all basic human characteristics and values, which leads me to think that my good friend, Dr. Helen Caldecott from Australia, but trained and educated at Harvard and was a staunch anti-nuclear activist, well known all over the world. She said to me, and I included it in my film 30 Seconds to Midnight, boom, the doomsday clock. She said this at the very end, and I wonder, are we an evolutionary aberration designed in an evolutionary sense not to survive? Dimitri, I wonder. Thanks so much for being with me tonight again. Man, I really count on your very insightful, wise, and knowledgeable insight on all of these things. We'll look forward to having you again, my friend.
I hope there will be an again, my friend. So the way things are going, you just can't be sure anymore. So